lovely sunny Kingston morning. And we have a very exciting lineup. My colleague Jeff Collins, who is chairing the seminar series this year, and Ronnie Jakes, they have put together a really exciting series for this year. And stay tuned for the weekly newsletters to get the news about upcoming events. We have another one in just about 2 weeks from now. We also have a full Arthur Door Lounge series that happens in the evenings and some Thursdays. I am very pleased and excited to welcome our speaker today, Professor Heidi Tworek. Heidi is the Canada Research Chair and Associate Professor of International History and Public Policy at the University of British Columbia, where she also serves as the Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Heidi is a Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the Canada Global Affairs Institute. She, as some of you would know, is also the co-editor of the Journal of Global History. Heidi is primarily a scholar of the history and policy of communications, especially the interface between new media technologies and democracy. The range of her scholarship is simply mind-boggling. Her publications have been in the fields of media and communications, journalism history, business history, transatlantic politics, digital economy, history of technology, legal history, digital history, and the history of health. She is an extremely prolific scholar, and her publications have appeared in some of the most prestigious of venues. Most notably, her book, News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945, came out of Harvard in 2019. It's a strikingly interesting book that looks at how Nazi Germany manipulated and steered media, propaganda, and news to shape the contemporary war, and how, more generally, modes and modalities of communication have changed the course of history. The book won the 2021 David Barclay Book Prize of the German Studies Association, the 2020 Ralph Doroni Prize of the American Historical Association, and was either finalist or shortlisted for numerous other book prizes, including the Wallace K. Ferguson Book Prize of the Canadian Historical Association. If I were to list her publications, there would be no time left for the talk. But Heidi is also author of several edited collections, with I believe 2 forthcoming, and at my last estimate, the author of about 45 articles and chapters, all of which she did in the last 10 years, since completing her PhD at Harvard in 2012 under the supervision of our dear friend Charles Mayer. Heidi has also worked and published in many non-academic venues and prominent magazines and newspapers like Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Politico, the Global Mail, also the New York Times, Financial Times, and CNN. And she also frequently appears on radio and television in Canada, the US, Germany, and the UK. So I'm so pleased that you are here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heidi.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to Jeff, who can't be here because he too, the interdisciplinary scholar, is at the American Political Science Association in Montreal. It's really a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be here in person. I'm glad that we postponed from March so that I can actually see faces when I present, rather than just a little Zoom screen. So I decided today to talk to you about some of the issues raised from my book and how they apply to the present, rather than talk about health communications, because I figured lots of us were very sick of talking about COVID and we could do a break. So instead we'll go to the somewhat lighter, quote-unquote, topic of information manipulation in the past and present, particularly by Germans. So I'm going to take us back to the moment of March of 1917, a crucial moment in World War I. You would think that Germans would be focused in their magazines and newspapers on questions around the United States, around submarine warfare, etc. But in fact, in one of the major satirical magazines in Germany called Kladderadatsch, they devoted an entire special issue to polemicizing against one particular form of business. Here is one example of the cartoons that came out in this special issue. And it says in German, Die Lüge ist der Weltgesetz, dies lehrt das Reuters Kabelnetz. Or lies are the law of the world, Reuters cable network teaches that. And here we see the gremlin, which is meant to personify Britain, gnawing on the world, and out of his sharpened fingernails come the cables that purportedly are disseminating through the Reuters news agency lies all around the world. So Kladderadatsch in this March 1917 special issue spends 50 pages of poems, articles and cartoons polemicizing against the Reuters news agency and how it is purportedly undermining German efforts in World War I, not just in Europe, but as you see from a global perspective. So how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point where a British news agency is so well known that a major satirical magazine can spend an entire special issue polemicizing against it and believe that it's so important in the curse of World War I that this is what needs to be talked about at this moment? So that's the first thing that I'm going to talk about in this talk, because for many of us, what a news agency is something that we don't think about every day. We don't think about the power of networks behind the news. So I'm going to explain how it is that German elites across the political spectrum, industrialists, journalists and academics, by the end of World War I, had come to the consensus that actually they needed to control news agencies in order to try to influence and manipulate global news, and that that in turn would influence geopolitics, economics and culture to be more favourable towards Germany. I'm then going to give an example of how one of these news agencies was used by German elites across 3 political regimes. And this is one of the things that I talk about in my book, is to go beyond just looking at one political regime, saying the Nazis operated with news in a particular kind of way. Instead, I show how actually across from Imperial Germany, which was semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic, through the democratic Weimar Republic, and into the fascist, authoritarian Nazi regime, there are actually surprising continuities in the belief of new communications technologies to achieve political and economic aims, and there are in fact strong continuities even of the particular businesses. So it gives us an idea of how we can, in history, use businesses and technology to trace continuities across political regimes and to trace across space as well, and to understand new ways of bringing together national and global history. Because as you'll see when I get to this second part, how Germany conceived of the world was actually quite different than, for example, the British or the French, and we can use news networks as a way to get at that question. What was the German vision of the globe and what did it look like? And then finally, I want to, in the final part of this talk, go beyond some of the things that were in this book and some of my other publications, and talk to you about some of the ways that I've tried to bring history into contemporary politics and regulatory discussion. So of course, over the last particularly 6 years since 2016, questions of information manipulation, the role of new technologies have been things that are regularly front page news. And Canada is one of many countries that is trying to figure out how to regulate the online space. And one of the major claims that's often made by every politician, etc., is that we live in an unprecedented era. But of course, my work shows that that's fundamentally untrue. We have grappled with new communications technologies multiple times in the past. So I'll just talk at the end a little bit about the multiple ways I've tried to think about the uses of history and how we can use history responsibly in policy discussions. And I'll be very happy to talk more about some of the spaces. I've done that including recently in the summer as one of the 12 members of an expert advisory group to the Canadian Heritage Ministry as it thinks about how to regulate online harms and online safety. But I'll be very happy to talk more about that in questions, because I'll only have a little bit of time at the end because we're in a history talk, so we're going to focus on the history. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is how did we get to this point in 1917, what I call a news agency consensus, where elites and at least a certain amount of the reading public believed that news agencies, this particular business, was so incredibly important that it was key to German geopolitical and economic prowess on the global stage. So now if you've been wondering what a news agency is, oh happy days, I'm going to explain to you what it is. So news agencies emerged as a particular form of business in the mid-19th century. They emerged almost simultaneous to the creation of submarine telegraphy, so the first time that we really start to have news that can move much, much faster than people or goods. And news agencies emerged as a new form of business that stations correspondents around the world to try to take advantage of this rapidly expanding submarine telegraphy. These businesses and their foreign correspondents then collect that news, they send it back to their respective countries, where that is then collated and disseminated to newspapers. Now, there are very high fixed and sunk costs in this kind of network. You have to station correspondents even in a place where you don't know whether there's actually going to be news or not. And it's very expensive to send telegrams. And this means that there are very few news agencies that end up emerging, because they need to have enough customers, newspapers, to make this entire endeavor worthwhile. So one way to think about this is that news agencies are like wholesalers who are selling to their retail clients newspapers, who will then decide which of those news agency items they're actually going to print in the newspaper. Now, news agencies are the fundamental key to the types of national and international news that the vast majority of newspapers were printing. So to give you a sense of this, even in the 1920s, 90% of German newspapers, that's 90%, relied on news agencies and correspondence agencies for their international and their national news. So that means even news from Berlin. So often when we're doing historical research, we're going to be looking at things like the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, New York Times, London Times, and we see that a lot of their news is coming from their own foreign correspondents. We're talking about global news. But in fact, they are the exception and not the rule as to how newspapers operated in the past. And even those very high-level newspapers, if you look very carefully at the bylines, you'll often see there are things coming from the Associated Press, the Canadian Press, etc. And those are news agencies that are, in effect, the bottleneck of global news. Now, the first news agency that's ever created is the one in the middle here, Agence Havas, is created in the 1830s in France. In 1848-49, after revolutions in the German lands, two Jewish men, Bernhard Wolff and Julius Reuter, flee the German lands to Paris, where they work together with Charles Havas, who is the founder of Agence Havas. In 1849, Bernhard Wolff returns to Berlin, where he decides to found his own news agency, now inspired by what had happened in Paris. And Julius Reuter eventually makes his way in 1851 to London in advance of the opening of the first submarine cable between Britain and France. And in the interim, Julius Reuter has a smaller side. He briefly is in Aachen, where he tries to use pigeons for this. So and actually, for the first time ever this summer, I got to go to Aachen and I got to see the Reuter house. It's a little disappointing because now it's just an apartment building and next to it a Greek restaurant. Really small plug. But if you ever go to Aachen, you can go to the Reuter house and see the sort of beginnings of this system. So the three founders of all these news agencies knew each other. And by the mid-1850s, they realized that there were these very high fixed and sunk costs for collecting all of this news, but that in fact they were delivering it to different customers. And so that the best way that they could actually make this business work was to form a cartel. So they divided the world between them, and they had their own individual correspondents who were collecting the news in these various areas, which were meant to be places that were politically, culturally, or economically somehow tied to Britain, France, or Germany. They collected that news, and then they exchanged it between each other, and then that was forwarded onwards. So if you were, for example, a British person reading an item from Reuters, and it was about South America, it would claim it was by Reuters, but in fact it had been collected by Agence Havas in Latin America. So this system exists for an astonishingly long time. The cartel contract is renewed every 10 years, but it basically exists until the outbreak of World War II, with a very brief break during World War I for obvious political reasons. The Associated Press, the American news agency, participates from the late 1890s until 1934. But this is an astonishingly long-lived cartel. Most cartels in coal, steel, etc. last 5 to 7 years. This one lasts basically 70 because it's so profitable and important for these news agencies. There's no way they can afford to have correspondents stationed around the entire world. Now, for the first 30 to 40 years of this system, Wolff, the German news agency, which, if you can read this here, it's a little bit difficult to read, I realise if you're at the back, but it only collects news on the German colonies, Scandinavian, Russian cities, so much less geographical area than Reuters and Havas. But the first 30 or 40 years of this system seemed perfectly fine to German elites. This was the period of German unification, and in the 1870s and 1880s, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck saw Germany much more as a European power. But from the 1880s and the 1890s onwards, an increasing number of German elites came to believe that for Germany to be a global power, it had to be an imperial power, it had to be a colonial power, it had to have, as one person put it, quote unquote, its place in the sun. And so as they started to believe that Germany needed to have its quote unquote place in the sun and engaged, as Britain and France had, in violent imperial and colonial conquest, these elites looked at this news agency system and came to believe that it was actually pushing against those imperial and global ambitions. So there started in the 1890s to be increasing discontent from a geopolitical perspective with a news agency system that seemed to box in Germany's global and imperial ambitions. That political discontent then overlapped with increasing discontent from industrialists, again from around the turn of the 20th century. So from the time of the Second Industrial Revolution onwards, Germany was steadily increasing, slowly but steadily increasing its percentage of world exports. And German industrialists were increasingly interested in exporting their goods. And one of the things that concerned them when they looked at the information ecosystem was what they felt was an asymmetry of information. And this operated for them in two directions. So firstly, they were worried that places they wanted to export their goods to, particularly places like Latin America or East Asia, would not get reliable news about Germany because that news was being filtered through the British and French news agencies. And they worried that that was news that was being filtered that was either insufficient about Germany or somehow discriminatory against it. And then in the opposite direction, they worried that they weren't getting the kind of information that they needed from, again, places like particularly Latin America and East Asia to produce the kind of goods for export that people in those countries wanted to receive. So from the 1890s onwards, we see increasing discontent from industrialists and economists who believe that this information system, which they see as underlying Germany's exports, is actually mitigating against increasing German success. So there's political and economic discontent, and finally, that comes to a head with discontent with the technological system that is underlying the news agency cartel as well. So I mentioned that submarine cables start spreading from the 1850s onwards, and they are mostly laid by a British and American company, which is known as the Eastern Associated Company. It's a conglomerate of multiple companies. But most of the submarine cables that are laid in the first 30 or 40 years of submarine cables are laid by this company, which is headquartered in London and seen as British. And from the 1890s onwards, the British government also becomes much more involved in cables and even subsidises the final link to create what they called an all-red line around the world, where there would be cables that landed on British imperial territory and went around the world. And the final line was finished in 1902 between Vancouver and Australasia. It doesn't make any profits. It's subsidised by the British government in part for these geopolitical reasons. So the first 30, 40 years of cable's existence, including through the International Telegraph Union, these cables are mostly seen as neutral conduits. But from the 1890s onwards, the Germans, but also the French and the Americans, come to worry that if the British in some way could control these cables, they could also censor the content. And for the Germans, at least, with the context of the Boer War, they come to believe that that's the moment that actually proves that all their suspicions are right, that actually the British are censoring news from South Africa back to Europe. And so in response, not just Germany, but also France and the United States start to lay a whole host of submarine cables. They're often duplicating routes that already exist. It's not for capacity reasons. There's plenty of capacity on the lines that already existed. It's because of these geopolitical concerns. But then Germany goes beyond those submarine cables and starts to invest in a new technology that can bypass submarine cables altogether, and that's wireless telegraphy. And here's where this part about new communications technologies and the importance of understanding the political and economic incentives behind them comes into play. So in the early 1900s, as wireless telegraphy is very much in its infancy, the German government intervenes in private enterprise and forces two companies, AEG and Siemens and Heise, to get together and to form a joint subsidiary which was called Telefunken that would engage in research and development in new wireless telegraphy. And initially the first place where wireless telegraphy seems to be most promising is for navies, because it's the first time that navies can coordinate their moving ships on the sea. And for the first 5 or so years of Telefunken's existence, about 70% of all of its revenue is coming from the Navy and the German military, which wants it to develop this, particularly to create wireless on ships. And so that means that the world of wireless looks quite different than cables. You have Marconi, who's Italian-born, but based in Britain, who's the one who's much better known, I think, to many of you. I see you nodding. But actually, Telefunken becomes increasingly successful. So if we just take wireless stations that are placed on ships, we see that actually by the outbreak of World War I, there's an almost tripartite division between Marconi, Telefunken, and then some other wireless stations. So this is in the more commercial realm of ships. It's obviously being used on naval ships. And then the German Colonial Office is also invested in wireless, because it seeks to create, and this is by 1914, before World War I breaks out, what it sees as an all-wireless equivalent to that British all-red line around the world. So because Germany is so concerned that if a war breaks out, as it happened with the Boer War, that what the British would do was censor cables, or perhaps even cut them, the German government Colonial Office decides to invest in a technology where there are simply no cables to be cut. So even though at this point wireless is less reliable, it's still a relatively new technology, they decide to create an all-wireless route to connect German colonies. As you can see on this map, the black here represents German colonies, some of which are very small islands. This was the route that by the outbreak of World War I, the German state had chosen to try to connect its colonies as a sort of fallback in case war broke out and the British did indeed decide to weaponize cables. And I just note for later, there are 2 towers on the east coast of the United States, in part meant to connect with the very large German diaspora, because most Germans, about 90% of Germans who emigrated in the late 19th, early 20th century, went to the United States. So this was part of the reasoning for putting those 2 towers on the east coast. Now this system is not well known because it's only completed a few months before World War I breaks out. But actually, if we look at World War I as a global war, many of the initial battles are actually over the Allies wanting to conquer some of these wireless towers and destroy this communication system. Some of them very not very well known battles, such as the Battle of Bitterpacker in October of 1914, which was to conquer one of the wireless towers here in the Pacific Ocean. So for German elites, when World War I breaks out, this seems to confirm all of their paranoia that if there was going to be a war with Britain, it was going to be an information war as well. Because one of the first things that Britain does when World War I breaks out is to cut all but one of the cables that connect Germany to the outside world. And so even as World War I progresses, and there are all sorts of internal disputes between various ministries within Germany, between the military and other ministries as well, one of the few things they can all agree on is the importance of wireless telegraphy as a way to try to bypass the cable system. Because they see the cable system, here's just another example, is from another satirical magazine, Simplicissimus. This is in 1915. Again, just showing you this kind of consensus that what cables are doing is they're controlled by Britain. That's the little toad with his British top hat, and the cables are vomiting out lies, snaky cables. And what it says, this translation to English, as England's cables are still intact, it can still distribute its main export article around the world. And the title here is Die Lügenzentrale, or the headquarters of lies. So it's saying its main export article from Britain is lies, implying that what one needs to combat that from the German perspective is to establish wireless networks that can send German news out into the world to combat the lies that the British are telling. And so by 1917, the Germans had continued to invest in wireless telegraphy, and they had actually constructed the tallest wireless tower in the world at Nauen, just outside of Berlin. They claim that it could reach all the way to Sydney, but I don't believe that's physically possible, given the contours of the Earth, but this was one of the things that they claimed. Now, I've talked much more about the technology that's underlying this system, and now I'm going to move to talk a little bit about the news agencies, some of the agencies they use to actually distribute news around the world via wireless telegraphy, which obviously would grow in reliability over the course of the 1920s, morphs into spoken radio, but actually wireless telegraphy is used all the way into the 1940s. So in the book I look at 5 different news agencies. Fear not, we will leave out the first 4 because it's not possible to go through so many in a talk, and I'm just going to focus on number 5, Transocean, or Transocean as I'm going to call it, to give you an example of, as I said, how Germany viewed the world. Because as we'll see, it's a little bit different than, for example, a British colonial or French colonial perspective. So Transocean was founded in 1913. It was a coalition between industrialists like Alfred Hugenberg and politicians who believed that Germany needs to use wireless to send its news around the world, particularly to Latin America and East Asia. Over the course of World War I, the industrialists become somewhat disillusioned with this system, and so they end up leaving to found their own news agencies or later to purchase their own, such as Telegraph Union, which is another one that I look at in my book. Now, the people who are involved in this are extremely high level. When they have their board meetings, they always have their board meetings in the Hotel Adlon. If you've ever been to, I see a nod here, if you've ever been to Berlin, you can now go near to the Brandenburg Gate on that square where there's also the French embassy and so on, is the Hotel Adlon. And some of the people who sat on the board included, for example, the later Chancellor and Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann. So just to give a sense of, although this is not a well-known company, it's actually something that many politicians deem to be very important. Even already during World War I, this was a news agency that had surprisingly considerable success. And this is just an example of how using the amazing collections of digitized newspapers can help us tell a different story. So the classic story about German propaganda during World War I is that it was completely useless, nobody knew what they were doing, totally uninfluential. I exaggerate, but that's the general tone of it. And in fact, what I found in the archives was evidence that, in fact, Transocean had been sending its news to those 2 wireless towers on the East Coast, and it was getting printed by American newspapers. It was sending that news in English. And then I could use the Chronicling America and other databases to see whether that assertion was really true. And I found that it was. So this is just one example. This is the Ogden Standard from Utah. Transocean is known as the Overseas News Agency. And here you can see in 1915, there are 3 front-page stories that are citing Overseas News Agency. It tended to be more news about the Eastern Front, which makes sense, but the amount in which it was published was actually considerable. So this is all of the newspapers that we could find that printed items from Transocean. This, of course, ended in April of 1917 when the United States entered into the war, and one of the first acts of war on the United States was for members of the Navy to enter into the Sable Wireless Station and prevent any Germans from being there anymore. After World War I, the Allies recognized the importance of wireless stations that the Germans were using to disseminate and attempt to disseminate news to multiple places. And so the Versailles Treaty has an article that foresees that Germans are not allowed to send any news over wireless for 6 months after the treaty was signed. Now, for some bizarre reason that I've genuinely never been able to get to the bottom of, the Allies decided to list which wireless towers the Germans could not use, and they omitted one, whether by design or unintentionally, and so the Weimar government continued to send wireless news, and they continue to use Transocean as well, and to subsidize it using the Foreign Office, which is the place where a lot of matters related to information were actually located. And even though the Weimar Republic was democratic, many of the same debates about the power of information continue, though in different valences. And there's continued attention to how Germany could use news agencies and wireless to try to change global visions of Germany. And we see that even in the early 1920s already, there's consternation over this system. And I'll just give you one example. So in 1921, 1922, Alfred Halsworth, better known as Lord Northcliffe, decides to set off on a trip around the world. For those of you who study British history, he might be well known to you as a major press baron who founded the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, and in the early 20th century purchased what was then the ailing London Times. He's also very much involved in British propaganda during the war. So, of course, being a good British baron, he decides to travel on a British ship, the ship P&O Law. But he is horrified to discover on his trip that the news he's receiving by wireless on this ship is not from a British source, but it's from the Transocean. So when he lands in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, in January of 1922, he grabs one of his London Times correspondents, and amongst other things he says the following. Germany may not have money for reparations, but she is expending immense resources in propaganda in the Far East by daily wireless from Berlin. And here he means Transocean. The wireless is sent out 7 days a week and is hungrily absorbed by vernacular writers in all Far Eastern countries where countless wireless stations now exist. Now, of course, there's lots of exaggeration going on here, but you get a sense that he's trying to really play up the importance of this. I was a close student of the notorious Berlin wireless during the war. I believe that the same minds are writing the present mischievous dispatches. Now, he was right that many of the same people were actually still involved in Transocean. But Northcliffe's upset doesn't end here. He pushes, and there are multiple articles that appear in the London Times that are investigating Transocean, also appears in French newspapers, goes all the way through to Japanese newspapers. Lots of outrage over the fact that even though the Germans should be paying reparations, they're spending money on propaganda instead. And it also leads to a question in the House of Commons, asking whether the Prime Minister knows about this German wireless press service. And this is one of the backgrounds that spurs the development of the BBC and the BBC empire, is fears of German wireless press services. And this is one example of what one scholar, Bernhard Rieger, calls the differences between British and German attitudes to technology. So what Rieger says, that he doesn't look at wireless, but I think it applies, is the British often viewed technology as a way to maintain the international status quo. And for the Germans, they saw those technologies as a way to upend an international status quo that they felt was stacked against them. And I think we can see this with wireless, that actually the British really only start to invest very heavily in wireless and in the BBC and BBC empire when they have fears that the Germans are going to be upending their international status. So in the Foreign Office in Germany, there's great pleasure that the British are upset by this. Huge numbers of newspaper clippings, massive files of all of these articles, which is how I stumbled on this story. And so during the Weimar Republic, the Foreign Office continues to invest in Transocean, such that by the time the Nazis come to power, this is the map of where Transocean is disseminating. So you can see there's still this focus on those ships that had so annoyed Lord Northcliffe, but also there's a focus on former German colonies, for example, in southwest Africa, Swakopmund, you can see just down there. There's a focus on Latin America and East Asia, following on from those economic concerns that I've mentioned. And then there's also a focus on the Middle East as well, and a little bit on the East Coast, but that's not particularly well developed in the interwar period. So when the Nazis come to power in January of 1933, this is the system that they have. Now they continue to invest in this system, they find it to be useful, they dramatically change the content, racist, homophobic, glorification of Hitler, all the sorts of things that you would expect. But the important point is they're building on a network of technology and a particular business which had existed and been built in the 20 years before. And they're also building on a philosophy that information matters. So what the Nazis do, I'm trying to say, it doesn't come out of nowhere, there's a longer and broader context. Now I've talked a lot about what's happening in Germany, and I just want to talk a little bit about some other reactions along with the British to Transocean, which is one of the ways I try to get at understanding whether any of this mattered at all. What were the reactions from other places? So I did a lot of archival research in places like France or Britain, Poland and so on, the US, to try to understand whether any of this mattered and whether elites paid attention. And what I found is that they absolutely did. So in the case of France, you'll remember that Agence Havas, one of the places it covers, is Latin America, so they're pretty horrified to see that Transocean over the course of the 1920s is sending news much faster because it's sending it by wireless, while the French are still sending it by cable. And so in 1933, they start to build wireless towers in Buenos Aires, even visually changing what the city looks like. In the case of the Soviet Union, which was interested in also expanding its information empire, TASS, the Soviet news agency, tries to enter into China in 1935, finds that Transocean is already there, and calls it a dangerous element for the interest of peace between the USSR and other powers, particularly in the Far East. And And in the United States, where Transocean really tries to re-enter during the Nazi period, so more in the later 1930s, by the late 1930s, Transocean attracts the attention of J. Edgar Hoover. This is one of those amazing moments when you're in the archive, you never know what you're going to find, you turn over and suddenly it's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover and you discover that he was actually pretty obsessed with Transocean. And he was obsessed with it because he thought that it was a cover-up for a massive Nazi spy ring in both the United States and Latin America. And so he gets very into trying to figure out how to prosecute Transocean, and by 1941 is when Transocean is put on trial actually for being an espionage agency. In retaliation, the Nazis imprison 2 news agency correspondents who are American. There is a prisoner swap. But Transocean is still put on trial, even though there aren't any actual individuals, and is convicted as an espionage agency. In many ways, according to Hoover's definition, one could say it was an espionage agency. It was providing some information that was solely used by the Nazi state. But this was also the Nazi philosophy of what news agencies were for. So it shows us this sort of blurry line between journalist and spy. It depends on who is looking and what their bureaucratic incentives are. So multiple newspapers in Latin America and in East Asia are printing Transocean news. It's not just being sent into the ether and subject to the paranoia of people like J. Edgar Hoover. It's actually being printed in multiple newspapers. And they're also sending a huge amount of material, not just in German and English, but also increasingly in Spanish. So this just gives you a sense of the huge amount of volume of material that is being sent. I've talked a lot about Latin America, and I just want to give you one statistic to show that even though we often think of World War II as one that is divided, where we have sort of Japanese and Asian war, we have a Europe-Middle East war, that actually in terms of information there was competition between the Nazis and the Japanese as to who was going to be supplying information to China, and the Nazis keep these very assiduous statistics about how many Chinese characters of Transocean news are being printed, and this is just to give you one example. So in Nanjing, actually, more news is being printed from Transocean than is being printed from the Japanese news agency Domain. And this actually causes at multiple moments friction between the Japanese and the Nazis, because the Japanese are not always happy about the large amount of German news that's being printed in some Japanese-occupied areas. So of course the system that I describe is one that is well known to the Allies, and when they enter into Germany from 1944 to 1945, one of the first things they plan to do is to destroy this propaganda system. And so all of the news agencies that I've described are dissolved, none of them exist after 1945. There's heavy control of the press, although historians have also shown how there are continuities. For example, some of the people who are very much involved in Transocean will end up being very important in post-war German news, particularly in West Germany. But never again will German politicians be as invested and as able to invest in news agencies as a way of pushing for German prowess. The DPA, which is the West German and now all of Germany news agency, is more of a second-tier news agency in terms of looking at global news, and it's one that is founded more on the Associated Press model. It's meant to be more objective, and there's less government interference in the 1950s and so on. You don't see the same kind of subsidies, none of that. It's much more independent. So it's a very different system. But of course that doesn't mean that the story of geopolitical and economic influences on information, on new communications technologies comes to an end with the end of my German story in 1945. And indeed, even the history of news and the press in Germany came back in surprising and disturbing ways while I was finishing up this book. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I've tried to talk to policymakers about why history matters, and to show you some of the ways that they've used it as well. So over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen some ways in which, in surprising, as I've said, somewhat disturbing fashion, some of the vocabulary of the interwar and Nazi period has resurged in Germany. It's particularly been used by those more on the far right who are demonstrating against immigration, for example, what they call the quote-unquote Islamicization of Germany. And they've decried the press for not reporting on this in ways that they believe would be accurate, calling the press, for example, the Lügenpresse, lying press, or decrying it as Systempresse, which I think is possibly best translated as mainstream media. So one of the ways in which then German politicians have tried to deal with that resurgence is to use their past as justification. To say that because of the Nazi past and because of the East German Stasi past, it's incumbent upon democratic Germany to actually put through laws that will hold social media platforms to account. So one example of this was the then Justice Minister Heidi Tworek, who's from the SPD, who in 2017 would often talk about that Nazi past as a reason why Germany had to act against American social media companies, which German politicians believed were allowing hate speech and other problems to flourish online. And so Germany put forward what was one of the first, really, laws holding social media companies accountable for the content that was on their platforms. It was a law called the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or if you can't pronounce that, NetzDG, the Network Enforcement Law, which required social media companies with more than 2 million unique users in Germany to enforce 22 statutes of German speech law online. So if you were in Germany, you saw something you thought was hate speech, you could flag it, and Facebook had to attend to it and adjudicate that within 24 hours, or it would face a fine of up to 50 million euros per post. And this was really one of the first laws trying to hold social media companies accountable. And it's part of how I started to get so involved in policy discussions, because I was so intrigued by Heiko Maas's use of history as justification, and I wanted to give a more accurate rendition of exactly what was that history, what did it look like, and that then took me into doing analyses of this law. So it's one of the main ways that I started to get interested in policy. But I think history also matters particularly for communications, because communications technology is actually where we see a huge amount of what economists call path dependency. The classic example is that many of the paths where we see the initial submarine cables laid are not only where subsequent submarine cables are laid, but also telegraph cables and even internet fiber optic cables. While we think of the internet as wireless, still 95 to 99% of international internet traffic runs through submarine fiber optic cables. It matters where they were laid, because many of the places where they are subsequently laid are very similar. So if we want to understand a lot of the disconnectivity of today, we actually have to go back at least 150 years ago to understand the imperial logics behind the laying of the first submarine cables. It's only really in the last 10 years we're starting to see completely new routes being used for fiber optic cables. Another way to think about history I think of is at least history as parallel. That history, by looking at the sort of structures of how and why political and economic elites become invested in new communications technologies, it helps us to understand a lot of what is happening today. So one that may seem quite obvious is the economic. What I described with news agencies excuse me, was a system where we had a bottleneck. Because of those high fixed and sunk costs, you have a small number of news agencies. And actually that's a world that's remarkably similar to where we've ended up today with social media platforms. There's only really a handful of them. Facebook, Google, TikTok, Twitter. They are bottlenecks of information provision. They structure what it is that we can send and how we can receive it. People who are more in communications and media studies call this the affordances of platforms, what platforms allow you to do. But I think of this as a more sort of basic historical and structural question, that we see there are bottlenecks of information provision. And as historians, we ask ourselves for political and economic reasons why we ended up in this situation multiple times. The other parallel has been the importance of technology to this story. So while we often think of and talk about content, particularly today, we might talk about hate speech, etc., etc., actually technology is deeply important as well. And this seems, I think, a much more obvious point post the banning of things like Huawei. But my historical story, I think, shows us the intertwining of concerns about content with concerns about infrastructure as well. So that interplay between infrastructure and information is one that happened in the past, but also continues today. And then finally, as I said at the outset, I think this is something that the historians bring to the table that's deeply, deeply important. Obviously, I work on this from the perspective of communications, but it's true for many other aspects of history as well, is that even on the most basic level, we can help people to disentangle the unprecedented from the precedented. to understand when something is genuinely a new phenomenon and when it's actually not. And so in the case of information warfare, disinformation, whatever we want to call it, often it's claimed that this is something that is unprecedented. But the history that I've written, I think, flips that on its head. It shows that actually in the international system, information warfare, if we want to call it that, is actually a feature, not a bug of the international system. So the question is instead, why is it that certain groups of people or elites, like the Germans did from the 1890s onwards, why do they become so invested in information as a means to achieve these broader goals in geopolitics, economics, etc., etc. So I hope you can see there's a way in which we can tell a history responsibly that also has a lot of things to say to policymakers, and I think this is also important in a world where sometimes history is used tritely to talk about the present, that there are actually ways that we have a great deal to contribute that doesn't mean abdicating our responsibility as historians. It actually means bringing our skills to the table to provide a new and different perspective to policymakers who are always so focused perhaps on the next election, whereas we as historians might be thinking about the century-long perspective, the decades-long perspective, and that has, I think, a lot that we can contribute. So with that, I'll end there, and I look forward to questions on both history and policy. Thank you so much.
I was just wondering, in terms of things that are precedented and unprecedented, would you say that there's precedent for the way that modern algorithms tailor information to people?
Yeah, gosh, that's a very good question. So I think it depends how far we want to ascribe human agency to algorithms. Because algorithms have been built by human preferences, right? So there are incentives that are put into those systems. So even though they might be run now by computers, at base they have some human preferences within them. They can be tweaked by humans. So we have to think of them in a way, sort of mixture of human and algorithm. So every newspaper is always the result of those human choices. What should be on the front page, what shouldn't be. And so I would see algorithms in a sort of continuum of that. What I think is unprecedented is this individualized delivery of it and the collection of data about us that is then fed back into the system to the individual. So my Google search is different than Claire's Google search, and so on and so forth. So the reasons why it's like that are due to human decisions, but that kind of individual nature that's also based on taking in that much data about us is, I think, unprecedented. And that's part of why the kind of data aspect of this is a part that I think we really need to be very, very conscious of. Because it relies on a level of surveillance that sort of goes beyond anything that we've seen in the past, because it is so individualized. But the choices about what we prioritize with algorithms and the types of data that are collected are still very much human choices.
Thank you very much. That was an amazing talk. I was struck by what you said at a certain point about how the British tended to use wireless in order to maintain the status quo, I guess, their empire, whereas the Germans tended to use it to upset that status quo. And I was just wondering if you could, give some examples qualitatively how they would do that. I mean, was it in terms of just not reporting certain things, or more kind of spin on certain topics? I don't know. I didn't. The British guy was so upset about certain things being reported. That was interesting. Or not reported. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a great question. So I think in many cases the British are using things like BBC Empire, obviously, to try to suppress news potentially about various things, or to portray a certain vision of Britain. And for the Germans, how they see this kind of information, it depends in which period we're talking about, right? So during World War I, they're trying to do various things like portray Germany as a country of culture. So they're still trying to do this kind of culture presentation, even though often they're getting letters back from various places saying nobody cares about what was on the opera in Berlin yesterday. They're still sort of putting that forward as this is some of the stuff that we're going to distribute. And at least in World War I, the Germans they're basically distributing the same news everywhere, which is also, they're also then getting reports back from, say, consulates saying this, this isn't really news that interests people in Japan, but they might have thought it would interest people elsewhere. And then, of course, through the 1920s. There's also a focus on trying to distribute some information that for the industrialists is seen as advantageous. So is it about certain German products, etc., etc. And then of course during the Nazi period, you'll have things that are glorifying Hitler and so on and so forth. But there's some really sort of interesting moments where there's report backs, where you can see, for example, that what Germans who are based in, say, Latin America will say is, look, nobody's printing an entire Hitler speech, but the politics dictate that they're obviously still sending the entire Hitler speech. And instead, what people tend to be more interested in is news that they're not, say, getting from a British source. But I think we can think about it as what the Germans are trying to do fundamentally is try to present news from a German perspective. What the German perspective is, it varies, of course, over this 45 years, really fundamentally, but they're trying to use this new technology to do so. And Adiga's book actually looks at things like airplanes as well, cinema, so he's showing from the perspective of these various technologies how Britain is using, for example, cinema to try to consolidate the empire, whereas Germany is trying to use cinema to present new visions of Germany. We can think of that whether in the Weimar Republic with Fritz Lang or in the Nazi period with Leni Riefenstahl. So that's the sort of difference between these two. It's a great question.
Yeah, huge question, sorry.
No, it's good. Huge question. Good. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm Amy. I'm a postdoc in Jewish history, and I'm going to ask a really on-brand question. Wojta, you mentioned, is Jewish. I saw your first photo picture of the Kremlin with its connection across the globe, this idea of a cabal that is dissemination of propaganda. How much does anti-Semitism play into this kind of these themes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it does so in multiple ways. I think you're absolutely right to pick up on the anti-Semitic themes in that first cartoon. They really sort of punch you in the face in a way. And it plays out in multiple fashions. One is that it plays out within Germany from the 1890s onwards. You have a couple of more right-wing, conservative members of the Reichstag, of Parliament, who question the reliability of Wolf's, which is the main news agency at the time, and they question it also on the basis of Wolf having been Jewish. So we see that at least occasionally surface in those moments. And then of course from the perspective of the Nazis, this is one of their critiques of the press in general, right? That it's too Jewish and this is why it's unreliable and so on and so forth. And so one of the main things they do when they first come to power alongside this, they obviously take over Transocean, but they also merge together the two main domestic news agencies, one of which is still Wolf's, and then they of course say we need to change the name immediately because we can't have anything that is related to Jewish people. And I also found all of the records where of course they also go through all of the employees, so the sort of classic things that you would expect, where they go through the employees to see who is Jewish, who has Jewish connections, and of course terrible and dreadful things happen to quite a number of those employees. So I would say it certainly plays a role, oddly not as thematized at certain moments as I would have expected, but if you look you can see it in the cartoons and you can see it in the way that certainly the Nazis approach this topic, but it's there before. I would say in the Weimar Republic, less explicitly thematized, but certainly from the further sort of conservative and Nazi perspective, it's very much there as a suspicion of the extant news agencies is coming from that anti-Semitic perspective as well.
My name is Rebecca Manley, and I've been in Soviet history, but that will have nothing to do with the question. I really enjoyed the talk, very interesting. I wondered, it seemed like the 1890s was a sort of crucial moment, at least in the way you presented your overall argument, that there had been a sense of these infrastructures as sort of politically neutral. And I wonder if you can give us a bit more of a sense. I mean, obviously for Germany, this is a crucial period. We imagine its rule. But to what extent are these German geopolitical concerns warranted? To what degree are those concerns prompted by a new sort of politicization or political use of these networks on the part of Britain? And how, you mentioned the World War, do we see that happening?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'd say it's a little bit of both, and I'll broaden out the perspective a little bit more as well, which is to say that I sort of mentioned briefly there's not just the Germans who are worried about this actually. So if we broaden the perspective a bit more and look at the United States as well, we see this is a moment when the US as well actually starts building cables towards Latin America. So you think about this as a sort of moment of the Monroe Doctrine, etc., etc. But cables are also a part of that. And there's a great book by John Britton that looks at that extension of cables down to Latin America as part of the US's expansion of its influence into Latin America as well. So I think we can contextualize it as something that is happening actually in multiple countries in the 1890s at the same time. The Germans are not completely unjustified in this view. For one, because the British government steps in and finally does subsidise that last cable between Vancouver and Australasia. So before that, the cables had been laid by companies who were seeking to make a profit, and of course there would be support from the British government in that they would allow them landing rights, because of course you have to land your cables somewhere. But they're much more laid with the idea you're going to have enough people sending telegrams back and forth, you'll make a profit. Whereas the vision with the 1890s cables, the British government will subsidise it, it will finish off this all red line around the world, and they hoped it would generate lots of traffic back and forth, and it would generate more trade between those areas, but that doesn't in the end up happening. So that is a shift in how the British government is thinking about these cables. So that, I think, is a somewhat justified paranoia. And then the other reason why the Germans get extra paranoid after the early 1900s is that the Germans, in their fetish for cable laying, they also want to lay a cable to the United States, but they need to land it somewhere, and they apply for landing rights in Britain, and they're denied. And so that, for the Germans, seems like an obvious example of the politicization of submarine cables, and it again pushes them to invest in wireless so that they can bypass Britain altogether. So some of it is perhaps a heightened paranoia, but it's not completely unjustified. We see from the 1890s onwards that these cables are politicized and they are subsidized by governments in new ways, not just in Germany and Britain, but also in the United States and France as well.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, echoing everybody else in the room, I think. My name is Megan Moulton. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow, but in classics and legal history. And I was really struck by the end of your talk when you talk about history as a parallel. And from my fields, a lot of medieval historians are worried about the false equivalencies of the medieval past, both for far-right groups here in North America as well as in Europe, but also, for instance, Putin's so-called article that he issued a year before the war in Ukraine, where he uses the past as justification for future events. And so I was wondering, as someone that is working with policymakers, trying to influence policymakers, as an historian, how you deal with these false equivalencies, and how you kind of, the dangerous side of history as parallel, I guess is what I'm asking about.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because we see it frequently.
Yeah.
We see it frequently, and historians of Ukraine, historians of Soviet Union, historians of Russia have plenty to do to... but I think it's also sometimes for them been a question of how deeply you engage the arguments when they are so demonstrably false, and that's a very complicated question, is how far do you engage the arguments on their own terms when it's a demonstrably false history that's being justified for a war, versus when do you talk about the use of history as politics. So I'm trying to make a little bit of a division there, and I know some historians of that region have sort of struggled with that question because they feel like if they engage Putin's narrative on its own terms, they're giving it validity in a way that they don't really want to, because it's based on so many false premises. So I think that's one way to try and think about it, is what exactly are you engaging in that moment, but you still have to explain as a historian, if you don't engage, say, Putin's historical arguments, you still have to somehow explain why is he reaching to history rather than something else. So that's why I've seen some people think maybe that's one approach that one can take with those kind of examples, is to explain, well, why does Putin think history is the justification? What is it about history that's so attractive to him? How is that a sort of misrepresentation? And what can then we as historians do about that? And I think there are, I wrote a piece earlier in the summer trying to think about this, because obviously we shouldn't overinflate what we as historians can do. I'm not sure that we could persuade Vladimir Putin not to invade Ukraine. But that doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do, right? Even if we want to sort of remain in the history realm, and I think there are lots of amazing examples of what people have done. So for example, colleagues of mine at UBC have really been invested in trying to document what is happening in Xinjiang, using CCP documents, translating them into English, not necessarily commenting on them, but really trying to create an evidence base so that we can really show what is happening using all the available evidence that they can collect, curate, and translate as historians, which of course partly is about creating an evidence base that can be used later, but also perhaps sometimes dispelling some myths, but even doing that translation work is already something incredibly valuable for many of us who couldn't read those documents in other languages. Other things that I try to do, thinking more with my history hat, is even to do things like getting students to create Wikipedia pages is incredibly powerful, because Wikipedia, wonderful as it is, there are many, many groups of people, places, events, etc. that are not well covered by Wikipedia. A huge amount that students can do. So every year in my international history course, I get students to write a page on a person, event, place, or organization that doesn't already have a page. And you'll be perhaps not surprised to know there are many women, people of color, places outside of Europe and the United States, organizations, etc. that don't have pages, and students are always shocked by how easily they can find a bunch of them, but then they write them, we put them up, and it's kind of incredible how many people look at Wikipedia, because even last spring, let's see, we had 20 pages, they went up mid-March, by mid-May they've been viewed more than 250,000 times, which is, you know, pretty extraordinary, and something that anybody can do in a class. So if you're interested, you can just write to the Wikipedia education dashboard, and if your class is less than 100 people, you can hopefully be accepted, and they actually provide little tutorials, so you don't need to worry if you're extremely technophobic, because the Wikipedia education dashboard explains it. And so these are some ways to try to at least make sure, okay, well when someone looks for the Wikipedia entry on Partnership for Peace, to take an example of something my students did, which was a sort of effort in the 1990s to think beyond NATO. And it was called Partnership for Peace, so if they Google it now, Wikipedia is going to show up for them, and they're going to have an entry. And so that at least creates a chance that people are going to be looking at a somewhat more reliable source, or if they're looking at Wikipedia, it's going to be a more reliable version of history. So I think there are things that we can do that don't have to be oriented towards the policy maker, that can already make a tremendous difference to the average person who honestly is going to be engaging with history maybe by Googling it and looking at the Wikipedia page. And unfortunately, there's not a huge incentive when you're in the tenure track to do it as part of your research, but I think we can all do it as part of our teaching. I say very, very easily, having done it for 3 or 4 years. I was quite worried before I did it the first time whether it would work, and I've been really, really gratified to see how much students get out of it, and then how widely consumed these pages actually are, which shows us that there's a huge appetite for those kind of pages. They just need people to create them, and we historians are some of the people who can do that. And then maybe finally, sorry for the long answer, but finally to answer your question about when you're in the room with policymakers. So weirdly, sometimes actually history can dial down the temperature. So if you're talking about something like, you know, Russian interference in US elections, and you're talking to a wide range of politicians, historical examples actually dial down the temperature sometimes. Because basically everybody can agree that Nazis were bad, hopefully. And so it dials down the temperature to have some examples from the past that are somewhat less familiar, but that show that there are similar dynamics. So that's one way. I know we often don't think about it that way, but I've genuinely found that in some rooms where people are of very different political opinions, that actually historical examples actually end up with people who you wouldn't ever expect agreeing. Whereas if you were talking about a contemporary example, their prior political positions would mean they would all disagree. So I think we can actually use history, and still accurate history, right? It's not a misrepresentation. Accurate history can actually dial down the temperature, because it just gives us an example of something that has happened in the past. That obviously is not always the case, but sometimes it can be.
I'm Maggie. I study sensory history. But I just had a question about sort of how you view social media as right now democratizing people's access to news or ability to disseminate news on an individual basis. And I kind of thought about this when during the discussion about data collection and how individual that is. But whether or not it kind of works the other way, where also people now have what might be an unprecedented ability to put their experiences out into the world, or to like create Wikipedia page and disseminate news on their own terms, and whether or not that has, I guess, historical links, or if that is something that is genuinely like new right now, or yeah, basically the positives of social media.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. So the first thing I would say is that we don't get to do it on our own terms, because we're doing it mostly through for-profit companies who structure how those interactions occur. So Wikipedia is one of the few examples of a non-profit that's still a major website, but most of these other websites, we're interacting through the terms of those platforms who, for example, have terms of service which we may agree with or we may not agree with in terms of what we can and can't put on there. And I think there are at least historical precedents for how technologies can seem to be emancipatory and then they end up getting controlled in different ways. And one of those actually is radio, because in the initial years of wireless and then later radio, there are a lot of amateurs who are very interested in using this, for example, working class groups who see this as a way of communicating amongst themselves, but this gets shut down multiple times, one during World War I when the military takes over, and then also during the 1920s, for example, in the US with the commercialization of radio, that actually shuts out a lot of those amateurs. So I think there's at least an example there where there was a potential for a very different kind of radio that could have been more local, community organized, working class, you name it, and that gets shut down. But then to talk about the more sort of positive side, yes, this is obviously a dispute between the many scholars who work on social medias. How do we evaluate, right? So for example, Sarah Jackson, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, did a piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago called "Twitter Made Us Better." And her argument is, well, Twitter enabled certain groups of people to organize, but also organize in front of the broader public, whether it was the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter or cell phone videos of atrocities like the murder of George Floyd. Her argument is that social media enabled a wider group of people to understand what was happening and to participate in that kind of organization. Whereas other scholars would say that's certainly true, but there's also a huge amount of online hate, abuse, harassment, foreign interference, etc. And it's very hard to create a sort of balance sheet of whether that's good or bad. I would see it as it's changed ways in which we communicate, and what we need to do as scholars is to understand not just that content layer, which is super important, and I do some work on that as well, but we also have to ask those bigger historical questions of how did we get to this point where it's mostly controlled by for-profit companies? What's the politics behind that? And people like Margaret O'Mara, who's written a wonderful book called The Code, which is about the history of Silicon Valley. We see historians already starting to do that. And so those are the kind of questions that I think we as historians can bring to bear as well. Yeah.
Hello, Calvin. I do early modern French history. It just seems from me from your presentation that it, like compared to say social media, it doesn't seem that the Telegraph has been as socially disruptive as media.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of and it sort of ties back to the previous question and goes back to these sort of fundamentals of what's known in STS as SCOT, the social construction of technology, that how technologies get used depend on their social construction. So you could have imagined a world in which telegraphy was like the post, right? It's getting used by everybody, it's being sent back and forth, but that's not how telegraphy ends up being used. It ends up being quite high cost, used by a comparatively small number of people, the press, industrialists, etc., etc. But what some other historians like Simone have shown is that that was a choice. That was a choice made by the people in the Eastern Associated Company because they believed that people wouldn't use telegraphy. So basically they had kind of two business models, right? You could have gone with high volume, low cost, or you could have gone with high cost, low volume. And they didn't believe that people would really use telegraphy, so they went with the high cost, low volume model. So why we end up with telegraphy as we did is because of this sort of social vision of technology. And what Müller shows in some other work is, for example, also the gendered ways that many of these people thought about telegraphy. So, for example, they thought that women were too loquacious and wouldn't be able to constrict themselves to a short telegram, so they wouldn't be good users of telegraphy, right? Which led them again towards this sort of high-cost, low-volume model, so it would be used by businessmen, the press, politicians, and so on and so forth. But that was a social construction. It didn't have to be that way. The technology did, if you laid enough cables, you could have had the capacity. And as time goes on, you have things called duplex and quadruplex, which meant you could send in both directions simultaneously. So you could have had a much more high-volume, low-cost model that could have had a sort of greater social dissemination. So anyway, it's a choice, I guess, is what I'm saying. And what some other historians argue is actually, if you wanted to think about the technology that had the most social potential in the 19th century, was really the post, which Richard John calls the Victorian internet, because it's in the 19th century that the post becomes so cheap that everybody can engage in sending letters in different ways. Although it was slower, it was really the post. And then in terms of social disruption in comparison with today, I mean, this is a really interesting question that all of you have opinions on, and I'm not sure I'm wholly qualified to answer, which is, what has social media changed? So this is a big question that some of the people involved in, for example, Black Lives Matter and other movements, is a question they now ask themselves. Yes, it gained greater visibility, but if we try to look at the outcomes, what has been changed by social media? What someone like Zeynep Tufekci, who looks at things like Twitter activism, has critiqued to say that actually, ironically, maybe one of the things that social media has done is create what some people call slacktivism, where one retweets but doesn't actually do much. So that perhaps, ironically, despite more information, there's actually potentially less social disruption that comes out of that. And I'd say this is an ongoing discussion between scholars. There isn't a specific answer at this point, but it's a complicated question as to how much this greater proliferation of information has and hasn't created social disruption. What are the real effects of this information is still sort of getting disputed and worked through in different kinds of ways. So is it changing how we communicate, but is it also changing how we interact with each other? Is it changing how social movements operate on the ground, or is it actually diminishing the power of social movements because they're mainly happening online? Anyway, big debates in communications, media, political science, etc., that I think are yet to be resolved. And again, that historians can bring to the table, because we're always interested in change over time, we're interested in social change, the role of information in social change, but the role of all sorts of other factors in social change too. So I think we've actually got lots to say to some of these questions, bringing older historical examples to the table.
Just circling back to the Ukraine-Russian scenario, I'm hoping that you might be able to bring some insight into this current event in terms of media censorship. Just recently, within the last few months in response to everything, Russian media outlets have been, censored in response to what's going on. And, which is pretty unprecedented for the past couple of decades or so, really since the Soviet Union collapsed, because they had allowed Russian state television and everything. And for a time, at least, actually, since the 2014 invasion, on the internet, you could still find Russian news outlets, basically giving what's called the Russian narrative. And in response to this, a lot of people in places like the US and Canada said, well, this isn't actually the right way to deal with this, because a lot of people will now, as they have, started to question things like CNN, etc., saying, well, all we're getting is our own propaganda, fake news, we're not getting their side of the story, you have to go to Al Jazeera, that sort of thing. So what I'm wondering is, have you encountered like an analogous situation in your own research, perhaps what you saw with the US up to World War I, when they intervened, that sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, there's an even more direct historical precedent, which is that the US, since around 2018, has actually started to use again something that emerges out of that J. Edgar Hoover context, which is something known as FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And that was something that was introduced in 1938. It comes out of many of the concerns about Nazis, fifth column, etc., requiring people who were foreign agents to register in the United States, and that's part of what sets off Hoover's investigation of the trans-ocean agents, because they don't register as foreign agents, and his argument is, well, they're being subsidized and paid by the Nazi government. and this remains on US government books, and it's revived actually to require, for example, Chinese media and Russian media to register under FARA. So I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, I think it was back in 2018, maybe talking about this. And then of course it raises the same question of what's the actual effect of that labeling, what does it do? So there is actually a sort of long history as to how the US is justifying some of this, goes all the way back to the 1930s. So a couple of other answers to your question. One is that the global perspective on what is happening looks quite different because RT, to take the example of Russia Today, RT also has a Spanish delivery, RT en Español, and those who are looking at a more global perspective see it's actually getting looked at a lot in Latin America. So if we look at this just from a North America-Europe perspective, we might say that much of this Russian media is not actually getting a wide audience anymore for reasons that it's hard to access. But actually, if you look at this from a global perspective, you see that a lot of those narratives are still certainly making their way in Latin America, Africa, some parts of Asia as well. So it's important. I think it reminds us again, as my story does, to not look at what is happening with media purely within a transatlantic lens, but to actually look at it globally means that some of the assertions that the politicians and others have made about the potency or not of Russian perspectives is not correct if you look at this from a global perspective. And then finally, those questions of banning or not. Yeah, it's an interesting moment because it's not the only tool that, for example, social media channels have. Now, on a TV, you either got the channel or you don't, but there are many other ways that social media determines what we see. To go back to the very first question, algorithms. So somewhere like Facebook, they can not just remove something, but they can also demote or downrank it. So when you're looking for something, they can choose, and of course in some other instances like Twitter, you'll see if something is state affiliated, and I think this remains a big debate as to which one of those instruments is appropriate and which one should be used. And there's a long history of states intervening, shaping in all sorts of different ways that may or may not have a huge amount of influence on what people believe. And as I say, especially in the Russia case, looking at it globally is a completely different picture than if we look at it just in Europe and the United States.
Thank you. That was super fascinating, and all these questions are really great as well. I'm a military historian, and so I was particularly interested in your section about how the Germans use their navy a lot to sort of set up the wireless system around the world. I thought that was really interesting. Is there another country that saw that and then said, we should copy that idea? I mean, obviously I'm thinking about the British Navy being quite substantial. The French, can you see that sort of use of the military or the relationship between the military and these news agencies in other countries?
Yeah, so to back up before I answer your question, I mean, it's also, I think, worth understanding within the context of German history at this moment, where the Navy is seen as very important. And anyway, so I went into the archives also in Freiburg to look at the military records, because the Navy is really sort of prioritized as a vision of competition with Britain, right, as I'm sure you know. And so I think it's not a coincidence that then the Navy is looking for these new technologies, also because the Navy is engaged in Asia as well, and so very interested in trying to coordinate. So I think that's part of, it's not a coincidence that it's the German Navy that's so invested. There are though others that are invested in that connection between the Navy and coordinating ships on the sea. Argentina, the United States are two other examples, but that doesn't then go on and get linked to news agencies in quite the same way because of the particular politics of how news functions within those other countries. So that second step, the link between military or military subsidies then going into other government ministries' subsidies of news is the bit that's a little more uniquely German. Cool. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan. I'm second year master's doing diplomatic history. So correct me if I'm wrong this assumption, but diplomats during this age would usually have like the press and the wireless to get information whenever they have their posts in another country or another part of another empire. Is there like a sense of sort of like strictures between, like, for example, British diplomats in Germany or German diplomats in London, etc., etc.?
Yeah, always a good question, because others have written books on this and actually shown how foreign correspondents become very influential over diplomats and over foreign policy. So particularly from around 1900 onwards, there's some scholars, mainly written in German, about this, like Frank Busch, who've shown how there's actually quite close connections in different kinds of ways. Also because sometimes what diplomats will be doing to actually get information on a country is they're reading the press in that country. So it sort of stokes this continual belief, right, amongst journalists, but also others, well, if we influence the press, then we're also influencing politics because diplomats are reading newspapers, right? So there's a kind of circular logic to it, but that's part of why it's important. But anyway, yes, there are scholars who've shown that foreign correspondents are actually kind of quite important for influencing the politics of diplomats, but also sometimes policy back home as well, so that they become almost, not quite statesmen, but they are very influential, really, in that kind of, particularly in those books, they're looking at the sort of 1890s, the 1900 to 1914 period.
I guess that brings us to an end. Thank you.